Welcome to our What Kind of Vampire Are You panel. This is our vampire-focused panel, and we have some wonderful panelists. My name is Jason Henderson. I am the publisher with Insure Yo, my partner at Castlebridge Media, and we're doing all of this in the day of the release of Bloodsucker City, which is a new and terrifying and really grisly vampire novella by one of our panelists, Jim Towns. But with me, and then I'm going to go through the list. I'm going to ask each of you to say a little bit about yourselves. But we have Jim Towns, director and author of American Cryptic and Bloodsucker City, and he's directing some kung fu right now, which is fascinating. Christopher Farnsworth, who has been on my interview show before and is famously the author of The President's Vampire. Leanna Renne Hieber, my good friend, the author of the very beautiful, Strangely Beautiful series and many, many other Victorian obsessed works, who we're going to be doing some work together very soon that we haven't announced yet. Charles Rutledge, who is the author of these really amazing adventures of basically occult detectives, and also the work Dracula's Revenge. And myself, I've worked in the world of Dracula. I wrote 3 books for HarperCollins called Alex Van Helsing, and also I wrote a comic for Image called Sword of Dracula. So we're a Dracula-heavy bunch, but we're a vampire-obsessed bunch, and we're going to be talking about vampires in media. And to me, that means any darn thing that you want to talk about, whether it's movies or poems or I don't know why I chose poems, but I guess I was thinking about La Belle Dame sans Merci. It was just literally the first thing that popped in my head, or short stories or what have you. So I'll tell you what, why don't I do this? Since I went down with a really brief introduction, why don't I do it again? But I would like you each to say a little bit about yourself and why, you don't necessarily always work in the realm of vampires, but what interests you about them and what brings you here. And then we'll go around and talk about your favorite variations. But say a little bit about yourself, and let's start with Christopher Farnsworth. Hello.
Hey, Jason. Hey, thank you so much for having me. This is really nice. I don't know. I've always been scared of vampires, which I think is what fascinates me about them. They're just such a terrifying concept to me. The idea of something that grows, fat and powerful while you die is really, this parasitic relationship with human beings. So I've always been interested in them, mainly because as a kid, I wanted to make sure I would know how to kill them. And that's why. So.
Very good. Thank you. Jim, welcome, Jim Towns. Your book launches today, which is a really, really, I can't express enough how bloody this vampire book is. But nevertheless, Willkommen, what brings you here? Talk about yourself.
It's funny that you find it bloody, and a few of the reviews, the NetGalley advanced ones have called it excessively gory and stuff. And I guess because they come out of film, that the description of the thing never seems as grisly or visceral as the depiction of it when I do that, but I like writing about gore more than I like filming gore, because when you film gore, everything gets sticky and it's a disaster to clean up, even in the best of circumstances. My name is Jim Towns. As Jason said, I wrote this book called Bloodsucker City that came out today, and Jason was great enough to give it a read and give it a home at Castlebridge Media. It's really exciting. And as far as vampires go, me and vampires go way back to seeing Lugosi in Dracula in the 31 film when I was really young. I've talked about this on my podcast a lot, how I think I was about 8 years old and I was obsessed with Universal monsters because Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein, and the original Dracula. This was a little before home video hit the market, so I couldn't rent the movies, and they weren't really being shown anywhere. And one October, like I said, I'm about 8 years old, and my mom let me stay up, and they were showing Dracula on TV at midnight on WPTT 22, I believe. and it was a Saturday night, and I got permission to stay up so late, and I got all ready, and I was down on the couch and I watched it, and I think I made it through the Transylvania part, and then about as soon as they go back to England and becomes the more the parlor room drama part of the 31 film, I conked out. So that's all I remember.
I mean, I still do that, honestly. That's you saw the best part of the film.
It gets a little more stoked there. Or whatever. But that's it. But I just think my draw to vampires, and I think a lot of people's draw to them is the longevity of them. I think it's the idea of basically a person or a sentient creature that can't die and has to go on through ages and ages. And I think we're fascinated and terrified of that by the same time. And I think that's what keeps pulling us back in.
So we heard one from Christopher, which was a creature that grows fat while you sicken. And you, Jim, talked a little bit about the sort of Highlander aspect of vampires, which is the curse of immortality, right? Leanna, I'm wondering where you're gonna come down.
Both fascinated and scared from a very early age. Dracula as a novel is probably my favorite book. If I had to pick a favorite book, it's probably going to come back to Dracula, because it's been a story I've come back to more than any other story. I read it when I was young, and all of the 19th century Victorian paranormal tales were my favorite books. And so, of course, that's why I started writing Victorian paranormal fiction when I was a kid. So, Dracula, Frankenstein, Picture of Dorian Gray, Jekyll and Hyde, all of those books, all very much chronicling a fascinatingly complicated era as well, and doing it in the way that paranormal can, which is commenting on the era. So I found that really interesting as I began to be a student of the 19th century and began to sort of look at, how can, what can we learn from the idea of vampire tales, because they are so universal. My favorite follow on from Dracula was, right around the time that I had started reading Dracula, was when Interview the Vampire came out. And I absolutely loved that film. I loved the books, the first books. It gets into the weeds as you go, but those first books are so powerful. And, growing up with a new revived interest in vampires was really kind of fun, because I was always interested in, okay, well, where did this all start? So, really going back, of course, to Bram Stoker, but then reading more about all the things that inspired Bram Stoker. When I went out into the world of professional theater, that was my background, and I didn't get into publishing until a bit later, but I sort of made a career out of chasing down 19th century paranormal plays to perform in. So
really?
I'm staying on brand. Oh, shocking.
So wait, those would be in the public domain. What's striking to me is, as a producer, I'm thinking, wait, you could get those for free. So yeah, no, continue.
True, absolutely. Well, except for the one that I was in the most often, which was Stephen Dietz's adaptation of Dracula, which is a modern adaptation. But it is, of all of the plays that have been adapted from Dracula, it is the most, by far, the most accurate to the book. It's one of the best literary adaptations for the stage, save for like Les Miserables. But being in that show, playing Mina for one professional company, playing Lucy for another professional company, I think just the power of the vampire was really driven home to me as an actor. My favorite moment on stage ever was when I was in the Cincinnati Shakespeare Festival's production of Dracula, and I was playing Lucy. And there's the scene in when Lucy is there's literally a stakeout for Lucy with the gentleman. And so she comes onto the stage, and I was covered in stage blood, just absolutely covered. And I had gone backstage and I did this little song backstage, and there was a microphone there. And so there was the bucket of edible blood and bucket of non-edible blood, and you would use accordingly. So I would take a spoonful of the edible blood so that my mouth really smacked. And we had on-stage seating. And so I did my little sing-song, and I come out absolutely drenched. My very long hair was all down, and I wish I had thought to have the picture to share screen. I might have to get that later. Because
if you have people sitting
I
on
stopped.
stage, I can imagine like saying your lines and just spraying them.
And that's exactly what happened. I was doing my little la 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 song, and you know, the droplets were spraying out, and then I stopped. So I was doing this little sing song, and it seemed like I was this lovely sort of vaguely human being, although drenched in blood. And then I got to center stage, and my hair was streaming from my sticky fingers, and I just stop, and then I turn my head and I sniff. And I sniff the audience. And in that moment, and never fail, there'd be somebody in the audience that would then vocalize something. And I will never forget this guy, the second row, Jesus Christ, as I stopped. And I just thought, that is the power of the vampire, to just, you know, these people know I am in fact a human being. I'm just an actor covered in sticky stuff. But that, for me, that push and pull of being able to be terrified and also being able to step into that was fascinating. I was just as interested as how vampires were portrayed on stage and screen as I was when I was reading them. So
that's really good. And also it's funny because it sounds like the guy in the second row was Snagglepuss. Like it was just
it's what it sounded like. And it took everything in my power not to laugh, because that would have really broken my spell over everyone. Yeah.
Wow, how cool.
Yeah. So that was a good day.
Charles, have you ever spat blood on an audience member, or what else brings you here?
I have not. My original interest in vampires, much like Jim's, was the Universal monsters, because I'm a 70s monster kid. So here in Atlanta, we had Friday Night Frights, and they would show, the Lugosi film, and then they would show occasionally the Hammer stuff, but it was mostly Universal. So I saw those. And then, as you know, I'm a comic book guy. And I grew up reading Tomb of Dracula and Don Glut's Dr. Spectre, where he fights Dracula. So I was very interested in vampires. And Jim Moore and I wrote a book called Congregations of the Dead, which is about what we basically said Southern Baptist vampires. So they're Christians, so none of the crosses or things bother them at all. But it was always kind of there in my interest. But actually, though sometimes I get called sort of a vampire scholar, I've really only been very interested for about the last 7 years. I was at Anachrocon, and it's actually the first time I met Leanna.
Yeah.
But it was also the first time I met Dacre Stoker, who's the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker.
He's the best.
He's the best. And his presentation fascinated me so much that I ended up going out and not only rereading Dracula about 5 times, because, I'm a writer, we're obsessive, but I got the facsimile of Stoker's notes and began studying those. And I've just become obsessed with Dracula, and have been now for about 6-7 years.
Wow, thank you. I think you mentioned once this a Turkish translation of Dracula that was translated back into English.
Yes, Powers of Darkness.
Yeah, I just picked that up. I haven't read it yet. I can't wait to dive into it.
Very interesting. And there's an extended version of that theoretically on the way from, I think, Centipede Press.
Well, it's funny because I just bought that one like 2 days ago. So if there's another one on the way, then I'll just simply buy yet another one, I guess.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I have looking over at my shelf, I have so many copies of Dracula that it's embarrassing. I just wanted to mention that when I came up reading, for some reason, my grandpa, I guess, had gotten me a copy of this thing that at the time was called the Dracula Book of Great Vampire Stories. But it was released under a number of titles, and they were all public domain, right from the 1870s through the 1920s, and so Carmilla was in there, and Dracula's Guest was in there, and pretty much everything that always gets anthologized. And I just fell in love with it. And to Leanna's point, to me, that sort of the wonderfully sweet Victorian and Georgian language, I really love that stuff. But Dracula specifically, I became fascinated by first, I think, because of the Hardy Boys, because the Hardy Boys met Dracula, and until
just watched that last week.
Well, until he's so imagine not knowing who the Hardy Boys are. Okay, so you're just watching this. Now, these two guys, I guess they sing, and they're here, and it's Transylvania, and there's Paul Williams, and they're singing all Paul Williams music actually, and Dracula keeps showing up, and Dracula is only these black boots. You don't know until later that Dracula is who he turns out to be, because I don't want to spoil the Hardy Boys meet Dracula for people.
No.
But they present Dracula as just a pair of black boots. And I mean, that was like religious iconography for me as a kid. All of a sudden, just the power of this character who was only known by these enormous black boots. It was great. So speaking of that, I had a quotation that I circulated amongst you guys from Bruce Wright in his book Nightwalkers. He called Dracula literature's most enduring Rorschach blot. And that gives me an excuse to ask, I don't want us to focus on, but he's the most famous. So we can start with that. What is your favorite Dracula? I just want to know. But then I'd really love to know, what is your favorite presentation of a vampire that is not Dracula? So, but first, Dracula, because everybody knows Dracula. What is your favorite version? You can, and I think I'll just, since I'm looking at the screen, I'll pick on Christopher first. Do you have a favorite Dracula?
Yeah, for me, it's always going to be Christopher Lee in the Hammer horror films, because I have a lot of affection for the Universal monsters, just like Charles and Jim. But those were nowhere near as scary as the Hammer horror films. We had an independent TV station that would run cheap old movies, and October was Halloween the entire month. So they ran all the horror Hammer films, and I got to see those at a young and impressionable age. And Christopher Lee was just terrifying. He was just a fantastic, commanding presence who was just radiated pure evil. And the battle between him and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing was, still, I think, the best showdown between the two characters that's ever been done on film. So for me, that was always, Christopher Lee always just scared me to death, and he was the best at it.
Can I just mention that he's a sexy evil too? That he's the bad guy. What's interesting about that one is he's the bad guy. And the movie plays with the fact that you are attracted to him, even though he is pure evil. I mean, he's not a seducer. He's an animal. He's a predator. But there's something that is magnetic about him, against your will about.
Right. He is probably one of the most. He's so evil that, I mean, there is no rooting for him. But it looks like he's going to win pretty much the entire movie. It only looks like pure luck when Van Helsing wins.
Yeah.
And I mean, but it seems inevitable. He's he's a great villain in that way, and he's never played as anything but the villain in those movies, which is, I think, that goes to my personal prejudice, which is that vampires are evil. And even though I have a vampire hero in my books, vampires are bad guys, and they should be treated as such. To ham-handedly segue into the next part of your question, what's the best non-Dracula vampire out there? And because Dracula is in a class by himself. I mean, Dracula redefined the idea of a vampire. Dracula changed our idea of what a vampire should be. Dracula, in the film and the book, created the iconography, even the use of a bat. All of that changed because of Dracula. So a non-Dracula vampire is a pretty different animal, is a pretty different creature. And it's close for me. One is really well known, and I think that's the Vampires in Salem's Lot, Barlow, and which is just much more like Nosferatu, much more terrifying, much more disgusting. Just a corpse basically pasted together with blood. And also a lesser known series, so I'm sure you guys all know it though, but is the Necroscope series. The Harry Keogh series, where it's the vampires are wrapped sort of into the Cthulhu mythos, and they're these really horrific, parasites. And so that, I think those are both really good extensions of the brand. They're really good they're really good ways to take what's scary and interesting about vampires and take what's fascinating about them and take it in an entirely different direction that doesn't include the capes and the bats and the castles. It's entirely something else, but it still takes what's interesting and essential about the mythology and turns it into whole new stories.
That first necklace, you couldn't escape those covers when I was
those were fantastic.
in my 20s.
Yeah.
Those are amazing.
It's a big fanged skull for anyone who hasn't seen them. And
they were beautiful. That first book, by the way, includes one of the first time slip tricks I've ever seen in a book. Maybe I just hadn't read enough, but it was one of the first where they trick you by using I can't even begin to explain it, but it involves time travel. Jim, what about you? Favorite Dracula and favorite non-Dracula? And I know that you host a show dedicated to the 40s. So
yes. So I mean, and I think anyone who knows me is going to know that the first name out of my mouth is going to be Bela Lugosi. But there's this distinction between favorite and best. Like I think maybe Lugosi might be our best on-screen portrayal of Dracula. I think more than any of the other characters, again, I talk about the eternity factor, the longevity, and I think Lugosi just captures the uncanny feeling of realizing you're in a room with a creature that has just managed to not die for way too long. The awkwardness, he seems, we talked about it in the episode we did on Dracula, like he seems like an alien. And I think a lot of that comes from Lugosi's, at this point, a lot of his memorization of his dialogue is phonetic because he's not that good at English yet. So, you hear people from Romania speak in Hungary and the areas where he was from, and they don't sound like Bela Lugosi. Lugosi has his own odd cadence that's uncanny, and I think that's, like I always say, like every Dracula impersonation is actually a Bela Lugosi impersonation because he was our first one we heard. Okay, I say that's the best. If we're talking my favorites, I think I go a few odd ways. Like I honestly, I love Guy Hamilton's version in Love at First Bite. I actually love him in this. It's such a great depiction of
George Hamilton.
George Hamilton. Yeah. George Hamilton. It's such a great depiction of a character out of place.
Yeah.
But he's been alive so long that he's savvy enough that he figures things out really quick too. So it's honestly, it's enjoyable like crazy. I mean, and Susan St. James. I mean, it's a hilarious film. I love Dracula in Mad Monster Party. Like, my favorite typo negative.
Yeah.
See,
already by the 60s, that Lenny Bruce Bela Lugosi impression had
Alan
become the thing.
His name's Alan. Alan Swift is doing Dracula in Mad Monster Party. I don't know, Jed. I love this. Least favorite, maybe John Carradine. I don't know. Tony Salvaggio and us talked about that on the podcast. I love John Carradine, but it's just like, man, to talk about, like, he just doesn't seem like, there's vampires and then there's Dracula, and he just never to me sold that feeling of that immortal creature. He just seemed like a pretty dangerous guy in a tuxedo and a cape. Favorite depictions of non-Dracula, I'm going to go probably with Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith's 30 Days of Night, and then the movie, based on the comic book. I love the moray eel type fang mouths that open up. I liked I love they have their own language. I mean, obviously it's an amazing idea of this town in Alaska that it's dark for an entire month. And what if vampires, took it over because they don't have to hide during the daytime. They can just feed on and on. And they're trapped. It's so claustrophobic. It's amazing. It reminds me of, and I'm gonna tangent for a second. I was just talking to my wife 2 nights ago. We went for a walk after trick-or-treating was done. And apparently there's a town, a little town in Canada where on trick-or-treat night on Halloween, parents have to patrol around with the kids with guns because they have this worry about polar bears coming out of the darkness and snatching away these little trick-or-treaters, which is just, I'm sorry, it's just really just
that's a great concept.
What a great, and I
mean, I know what you just told me is the truth, but I'm just thinking, if they were demons, now you got a story.
Yeah, no, but that's what it is. Out of the snow and out of the darkness, and just anyway, I really do love. I love the movie version of 30 Days of Night. I love the portrayal, the vampires, the makeup, and everything. And talk about a gory film. Holy jeez, but wow, really fantastic. And then, I'll talk about Max Schreck and Nosferatu as well. Obviously, I think that's a prototype of, we were talking on our episode of Castle Horror, Jason, about that it's almost like vampires fall into certain categories, and there is sort of like the dark messiah, and then there's the demon lover, and then there's like the rabid animal kind of thing. So it's almost like you almost have these subsets of vampire that, like, what's your favorite of the rabid animal type of vampire? What's your favorite of the, Dark Prince point. Vampire,
Well, and if you've ever played Vampire the Masquerade, which by the way, apparently has completely changed. And if you played it back in the 90s, it's all different now.
Is it now? I figured.
I'm not complaining, but I mean, they've changed the names and the background.
Right.
Of the
families and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a great example of, I mean, they coined that. That was amazing that they delineated these different tribes almost. Yeah.
So that Nosferatu was whatever they called their rat-like vampires and so forth. Yeah. Leanna, what about you? Favorite Dracula versus favorite non-Dracula?
See, I'm terrible in that I really can't pick because I love different portrayals for different reasons. I have behind me, and I'm always asked about what this is behind me whenever I'm giving a presentation. This is a poster of Guy Madden's Dracula, which is a movie adaptation of the Royal Winnipeg Ballet's adaptation of Dracula. So it is a film version of a ballet adaptation, and it's fascinating. And what I love about it is it absolutely hits you on the head with the uncomfortable undercurrents about Dracula that are going through Dracula. Basically, Dracula is the Victorian id cracked wide open for the world to see. And so it goes hard on, wow, England sure was worried about foreign men coming from for their women. And they lean into the not thinly veiled at all undercurrents in that book. And so it really is, it's an over the top, but beautifully done adaptation. So it's absolutely an art piece. But then, my love of the book, wanting to kind of just sort of relish and revel in all of these characters. While the film itself has terrible problems, one of my favorite Draculas is Gary Oldman. He's just really great as Dracula. That film itself it takes wild liberties, and certainly not all of the casting is great, but goodness, is Gary Oldman, I think, very effective in that, because I do think that you have to have, if you are adapting that book correctly, I think you have to have a romance in it. It has to have a romance, because there is absolutely a romance between Mina and Dracula that is unmistakable. And Oldman could shift between that romantic vision and then the creepy animal on both sides of it. So that's probably one of my favorites. My favorite non-Dracula. I mean, I'm really torn, because one of my favorite movies of all time is What We Do in the Shadows, because Taika Waititi as Viago is just this darling vampire, and the show kind of goes on from there. But the original film for me was really what is really my favorite thing, because it's lampooning the idea of vampires, but also as a lifelong goth, it's also lampooning our subculture, which deserves absolutely to be laughed at and with and beside. And so I love that film because it really does. It really does celebrate the love of vampires, and also how, subculture and interest in vampire lore is pervasive in fandom too. So my other favorite vampire film is Only Lovers Left Alive.
Really?
It's so marvelous, and basically nothing happens in this film. It's basically just it gets better. And it gets better campaign for vampires. There's a sad vampire played by Tom Hiddleston, and there is a powerful vampire played by Tilda Swinton. I'm sorry, but Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston are vampires. What more do you need? You need nothing else.
Yeah.
Nothing
It's a
happens in
wonderful
this
movie.
film, and it's so delicious and so delightful, and it is just it's their sort of little social experiment, that what happens when you lose, what happens when you are so emo for so many years, and
that's a wonderful way of looking at that movie. I hadn't actually. For me it was just I thought it was adorable. And also in some ways, as someone who's always felt like I have an old soul, I thought it was very fulfilling. And when you feel like you have lived lifetimes, and just don't take yourself too seriously, just lean on your friends, and and everything will be fine. And there's just a beauty of it, but it is such a peculiar film, but I love it very much. But I also have to let's see if I can. I don't know if I can. You can probably share.
I was going to try to if I can, like, my other favorite vampire is me.
Wow,
There she
is
is.
this you? This
There I
is the Bloofer lady, Leanna?
That is the blue. Yes, that's me in the
Nice.
flesh. So this was captured right in the moment of the Jesus
I love it.
Christ. So yeah. That's. I mean, honestly, I spent almost 3 years.
Thank you for sharing that. That was really cool. That
Thank
was
you.
really super cool.
It was actually the best photo of me ever taken on stage. And honestly, I would go back to playing Mina and Lucy alternately for the rest of my life if I could, because it was just such a powerful experience. Anyway.
I do want to ask more about the romance of Dracula and Mina, but let's save it for later if we can get to it. Charles, what about you? Yeah. Favorite Dracula, favorite non-Dracula?
My favorite actor as Dracula is Christopher Lee. He's my favorite just because he is so imposing, and that's how I think of Dracula. But my favorite adaptation is actually the BBC version with Louis Jourdan, because it's the closest to the novel. And so I kind of break it up that way. But something I have said, it's not, I love it because it is so close, but it's not extremely gothic. What I would like to see is something like a miniseries, Netflix, something that is that loyal to the novel, but has more of the gothic sensibility of the Gary Oldman film. That would be it for me. So, just to get that out there. But in terms of non-Draculas, I'm very fond of Strahd von Zarovich from Ravenloft, the D&D game, though I don't play. I just like Strahd. He's just a cool character, and he's very much Bela Lugosi in a medieval fantasy world, but I really like the character, the way he's portrayed. But my favorite non-Dracula vampire, and the one that's the most influential on my writing when I'm not writing about Dracula, is the character in Stephen King's The Night Flyer, because it is such a creepy thing. There's a scene, if you haven't read the story, it's a vampire with a Cessna. He flies around, and there's a scene where they open the luggage compartment of the Cessna, and all this dirt and worms fall out. And I'm just like, this is the coolest thing ever. And so he's so scary when the guy finally catches up to him. It's a very Night Stalker thing, where it turns out there really is this vampire.
Yeah.
So scary. And whenever I write, really creepy, dirty, smelly, down in the dirt and worm vampires, that's what I'm thinking of.
Wow, that's wonderful. Oh wait, okay, and that's your non-Dracula. So for me, obviously Christopher Lee. But to be honest with you, probably the one that made me fall in love with the character, like from an early age, was the comic book Dracula, as written not by Wolfman, but there was one that Shooter did in the Tomb of Dracula magazine, where he wrote Dracula as sort of he was as a military leader in exile, and evil, and constantly willing to kill people and use them for his various passions, but also this brilliant military leader. So Jim Shooter wrote this amazing story where Dracula falls in love with this Southern woman, and her father, the general, makes a trade. He says, you can have my daughter if you'll help the Confederacy win the war. And so Dracula summons, like, from the swamps, like snakes and zombies to join, and they win the battle, and so he takes the girl away, and they just go away, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah,
and
I read that one just a few weeks ago. Reread that one. Yeah,
that's an amazing version of Dracula.
There's some stuff in those magazines where they just, whoever Tony Isabella or Doug Minch or any of the Marvel writers at the time would just like, I'm just going to have a wild take, and off they'd go. So
it was amazing, and that I think one of the first short stories I ever wrote was about that kind of a Dracula. But as far as like non-Dracula, I love, if anybody's taking notes in all the movies that we're recommending, I love Let's Scare Jessica to Death, because in that one the vampires have taken over a small town, and it occupies this time where it's the 1970s, but it may as well be the 18th century, because nobody's going into this village, nobody's really coming out. If you go and buy a house there, you're probably going to get eaten by vampires. Nobody's going to notice. It's wonderful. And I mean, the vampires are freaking selling antiques on the weekend, like to people who drive through, so all these like guys from right. It's just brilliant. So I really love Let's Scare Jessica to Death. My good friend Drew Edwards, who writes Halloween Man, says that it is long and boring, but so fair warning. Mm-hmm. But for me, it is right up my alley.
Well, I should have mentioned Barnabas Collins, of course, because another big vampire influence and one of my favorites, big Dark Shadows fan. But
I can only watch Dark Shadows as like background, as just because there's no way you can watch all of Dark Shadows. Really, all I can really do is just like
I know people have, yeah.
Yeah, I have several times.
It's like 200 hours, right, or something like that.
Yeah, but keep in mind, I am one of the original jump off the school bus and go and watch Dark Shadows. And now not the early ones, I was only like 4. Yeah, I'm old enough. When in the last 3 seasons or so, I was old enough to like, oh my gosh, I got to go watch this at my grandmother's house with my grandmother, who was, horrified. It was great.
Unbelievable.
It has no continuity at all, which is, it's like trying to read Varney the Vampire.
Yeah, very much
the longest running 19th century serial.
Very much.
Which had 20 different authors and makes no sense at all. It's like the typesetting letters that fell on the floor are in there as they fell on the floor, and it went out to print, that kind of stuff. It's amazing. But I feel like Dark Shadows and Burning Vampire are very much in that. Like, who's doing what, where, with what? It's great.
I feel compelled to point out that Dan Ross, the Gothic novelist, wrote a whole series of Dark Shadows novels in the 60s. He was too busy to even watch the show. I mean, literally too busy writing these books to watch the show. So he had the Bible they gave him when they started shooting the show, and they said, go write books. And he wrote one like every 5 weeks or so. And he just pounded these things out as long as Dark Shadows was running. They have nothing to do with the show. None. He like only vaguely understood what the hell was going on the show. The house is called a different thing. The relationships are different. He doesn't
funny.
really, it is such a strange exercise.
The most interesting thing to me about that series, I have them all, but I haven't read them all. I've probably read about half of them, is that his version of Barnabas was never imprisoned. So he is a vampire. Old. He's just old. He's been there. So he leaves and he comes back, and he leaves and he comes back. And some of the stories take place in the Victorian age, and some of them take place in the here and now. And sometimes he isn't even in them very much. You can tell he kind of took one of his existing Gothic romances. He wrote as Clarissa Ross or any of his many pseudonyms, and then just kind of put Barnabas in there like, hey, how you guys doing? Back to the romance. I'll be
just
over
so
here.
You remember this is a Dark Shadows novel.
I'll be outside biting people. You guys go ahead. So no, it's like a parallel universe, Dark Shadows.
It truly is.
And then the Gold Key comic book, also nothing to do with the show.
Runs those them up. Good.
Yeah,
those are really good.
Yeah.
All right. But I want to get it. There is no track, but I'm going to get us back on track because I'm going to ask a complicated question. Do you believe that vampires work better in a story if the story believes in such a thing as good and evil? In other words, do vampire stories require an idea of morality? That's another way to put it. Is it sexier to be attracted to a vampire if it's sinful than if he's just a vampire? Do you understand the question I'm asking?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so go for it, Christopher.
All right, I'm going to jump in because I absolutely believe there has to be a conception of morality in a vampire story, and otherwise it just doesn't work. Otherwise, it's just the best the best counterexample I can give is otherwise it's just a slasher film, And slasher films can work with or without a sense of morality. I'm not saying all slasher films are devoid of morality. There's certainly the idea that you're going to be punished for your sins in some slasher films, but vampires have to have a sense of morality. I mean, look at Joss Whedon's Angel. Angel is only able to leap back to some semblance. He's punished for his lack of humanity, and when he gains some semblance of humanity back, he is tormented forever by what he was, by what he became, by what he did to innocent people. In order to be a vampire, at least post Dracula, you have to be willing to kill other people just so you survive. And that's, almost all of our morality is wrapped up in that question. What am I willing to do personally to make certain that other people are happy, safe, and comfortable and alive around me? What am I willing to sacrifice for the greater good, for more people, for other people? Vampires throw that entire question on their head. They're willing to sacrifice every other life they encounter if necessary in order to sustain their own life. That's how have you approached that? I apologize for interrupting. No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious though, because you have a hero vampire. So like how
I know.
How do you square that?
It's vexing. Cade in my novel, Nathaniel Cade in my novels is a vampire who has been bound by a voodoo curse, essentially, a blood oath he takes to serve the presidency of the United States and to protect the United States from all the things out there that go bump in the night, all the things that all of the supernatural evil out. Yeah. And that was my way of getting around the fact that vampires are irreconcilably evil in this world. Cade knows he's an abomination. He is also an old-fashioned Calvinist because that's what he was raised at as 150 years ago. He sees himself as beyond redemption, but he believes that he will never be saved, but he still believes he can do some good in the world. And that's that's where my head was at when I was writing it. I believe, there's a very old school of thread in Christianity that says this world is fallen. You cannot be saved except through the grace of God. And not everybody gets it, but you must still act as if the world is worth saving, even though it's not. And that's, incomprehensibly bleak, but that I think is the kind of battle you need a vampire for. That's the fight worth having.
Wow, that's really cool. All right, vampires vis-a-vis good and evil. Anybody wants to try to take? That was a really good answer. Thank you.
Well, Christopher, it's really some of what you said is something that I've almost never. I think I've thought, but I've never put into a clear sense. Guillermo del Toro has a theory that the vampire myth grew out of our collective guilt as a species because at one time we were cannibals,
right?
And we somehow created the vampire myth as a way to deal with that guilt of that without directly acknowledging that at one point we ate each other, which is even if there's no scientific base to it, I think it's metaphysically a really fascinating thing.
It's a way to go. It's a choice.
Yeah.
So
I think the challenge, and so maybe the lore of the vampire, is that it does though challenge us to find a morality that predates religion or faith. There's something feral and animalish about it. It's kill or be killed. It's predator versus prey. And I think that the challenge of it is I mean, if you are right, my book is you're never inside really what the vampires are thinking. You're always on the outside, and I keep them, secretive in that way. And I just think that makes them more scary for the purposes of this story. But I've written other things where you are inside the vampires, and I think that's interesting too. It's tough because Anne Rice really did explore those depths in her cycle of stories about once. What does it mean to be a killer now? How do you justify that? How do you rationalize that? How do you go on living and with the knowledge that you've taken life and stuff? And I think that applies to a lot of people who have been forced to take life in war and in other things. Again, it's the vampire is a metaphor for almost anything you want it to be.
Yeah. Again,
is what makes the character so pernicious in our culture and such a long lasting character. But to me it's about defining your own morality rather. A vampire has to recreate themselves as a new creature, not the thing that they once were. And I think there's kind of a horrible freedom in that, and I think that's alluring to a reader too. Is that you do have to I think all of us have to, at some point when we grow up, decide what we believe is right and what we believe is wrong, where our moral line is. And I think the vampire expresses that a lot.
Well, and you can have a character that you're riding along with. Enjoying a character doesn't mean that you approve of their activity. So just like watching a serial killer or an assassin or whatever. So, the guys in the interview, the vampire, it's a really good example how some of them are sadistic and so forth. And so you can kind of explore that. Leanna, what about you? Do you need a morality to have a vampire story?
Well, yes, but that morality depends on the world building and whose perspective you are enjoying the story from. When I mentioned Only Lovers Left Alive, they happen to be vampires, but it's also, it's so they are these killer beings, but that are having an existential crisis, which I find fascinating. So, but I don't think that we could have had that moment or that film if we didn't have over 150 years, hundreds of years of vampire lore to get to the point where we can have a movie about existentialism and vampires. So I think in terms of the morality, for me, it's really, okay, how does that where does that intersect with people's intimacy? Because the thing about vampires is there is an intimacy that is unmistakable, because it has to be, a vampire has to be close to feed. A vampire has to be invited in, if we're going by, the old school rules.
Sure.
And again, there is that, they have thralls, so you are compelled by them. And also there's a lot of othering, like we were talking about, the idea of the vampires as being this metaphor. Yeah, there's a lot of othering of like, okay, well, at least we're not those animals. But then those animals also have this incredible draw, and they have their own rules and they have their own code. They have their own morality. We see it that when Louis and Claudia kill Lestat, they violated a moral code of the vampires. So again, all of those things are in play, no matter which side of this world you're looking at. So there has to be that, because it's part of the conflict of any kind of given story. But I think it really is, for me, it's the intimacy of where do you find yourself, is especially because what happens when one of your loved ones is turned. And then suddenly the person you loved is a monster. And that for me is always very fascinating. So the only vampire story I've actually written is in Charles's anthology, Unholy Thirst, which just came out. So An Unholy Thirst is out, 15 vampire tales, and very, very different tales. And in that world, I have a futuristic world where a vampire plague happened. And they kept the Victorian aesthetics. So it's sort of this dystopian steampunk kind of Victorian society. And it focuses on a woman who is a part of the Mourners Guild, who are vampire hunters. And they have to sit with the dead in a wake for 3 days, just sit very still, silently with the corpse to make sure it doesn't rise. And she specifically works for the rich people who do not want to cremate their dead, as the poor people have to. So, she's on a call because, she has to go into the rich cemetery because somebody didn't follow the protocol about burying someone. She got a call and she needs to go in. And of course, this bumbling lord of some manor comes in and it comes into the crypt and sees his beloved rising from her grave. And of course, Catherine has to behead her. And it's all very gross business, but just the horror of that being a loved one, but also to the idea that there's a class narrative happening, and that's also definitely happening. Who is fed to the vampires versus who is able to fight them. So I'm very also interested in when this idea of morality also is put into a different class dynamic, because again, depending on where you're putting these stories, that is in play, whether we like to think about it or not.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. There's so much there, but Charles, what about you? Do you need a code of morality to make a vampire story make sense?
You do, but again, I think it does depend a lot on what sort of vampires you're talking about, because in a lot of the original folklore, and to a certain degree in Dracula, once you've been turned, you're not human anymore. You're not the person you were. In fact, in a lot of the Hungarian vampires, you have actually become an evil spirit. You're not a person who drinks blood. You're a monster. So the issue becomes, some people are telling stories about human beings who just happen to now they have to drink blood to live.
Right.
So you still have all of your original feelings and your problems and your issues. Dracula, Van Helsing even mentions that most of the vampires don't carry much of the person, but his personality was so strong that it, persevered. And so he is more, but when
it's a really good point.
Before they stake Lucy, they even point out that's not Lucy. Okay. Yeah. It's not her anymore. It's a thing inhabiting her body. So the morality there, of course, is the morality of the people involved against the evil spirits. But now if you're writing a more sympathetic vampire, back to our pal Barnabas Collins, who actually is concerned with what he did. I wrote the story for you, All My Sins, where the stand-in for Barnabas, he literally has to run into the people he turned, years later when he's a human. So, like I say, so yeah, I think it's there, but it's there in different ways depending on how you're approaching the vampire itself.
an element that pops into my head is actually, you mentioned Dracula and Lucy, who they stake, and Van Helsing may say she's not Lucy, but he also expressly suggests that there is an element of sexual violation to staking this vampire. And what's funny to me is the crazy perverse eroticism of Dracula, such that Mina's attraction to Dracula is perverse. It works because it's perverse. It works because he's the bad guy. That's why it's interesting. Because if he was just simply a misunderstood good guy,
yeah.
And Leanna, you can correct me if I have all of this wrong. But if he was just a misunderstood good guy who was, wrongly accused of doing horrible things, then it's just sort of a boring affair story. But he's a bad guy.
Yeah, but he's the only one who's listening to her.
Oh, interesting.
That's the thing, though.
Yeah.
That one of the things, like, Mina is the heroine of her own story, and yet no one around her, except for Dracula, is actually listening to her or has an accurate read on the situation. And so, everyone around her is trying to save the day without really letting her say, hey, this is actually what needs to happen. And it isn't until she actually does sort of take charge that anything happens to change the outcome.
Yeah.
She has her
psychic link with him, right?
Fuck off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, so I think in some ways that for me, it's the story is really about who is listening and who isn't, and who is able to tell the secrets. I talk a lot about, when I'm talking about the 19th century, about how, that is an era where people were not able to speak freely. If Lucy was able to say, hey, there's a guy in my room in Victorian society, then she could have said, hey, I'm in danger, but you wouldn't say something about there being a man in your room, because then you would be a fallen woman. If she was able to be honest about what was happening, she wouldn't have been killed. And especially not in that, the way where it, the horror is supposed to be that you've turned her femininity is turned entirely backwards, that she's eating children.
Yeah.
So the way that the horror for me it really hits home is the fact that no one's talking to each other. Not well.
Wow, that's a really wonderful read. I like that a lot. I wanted to, for a moment, touch on, why is it that certain works, is this just an accident of the copyright, or why do certain works get brought back? Like, why are there a million Carmillas and a million Draculas? What's the deal with that? Like, can anybody?
Those two, they're the archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
Dracula is the vampire. He's the guy. It doesn't matter. You can show somebody in any culture a rough sketch of Bela Lugosi. It's Dracula. They know who the guy is. And Carmilla, because she's the first real female vampire that everybody goes to. Yeah. And also because of the lesbian element, to whatever degree people may have different interests, but still they're the archetypes. It's like, that's her, that's him, and everything else just kind of falls into place, even though a lot of things preceded them, but still that's it.
I mean, so much so that, like, Daughters of Darkness, which I think is one of my all-time favorite vampire movies, and is a wonderful, I guess you could qualify it as a lesbian vampire movie, but if it is, it's one of the few lesbian vampire movies not based on Carmilla, and that's just kind of cool,
And The Hunger.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think what I
totally forgot David Bowie when we're talking about favorite non-Dracula vampires. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, he's fantastic. That one, I mean, I don't think it works this way in the novel, but in the movie, they carry little knives because they don't have sharp teeth.
The little onk.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my goodness, how great that was. Yeah. What I love about Carmilla, I read that one first at a young age, and that one starts with a con. It's one of the, I love that. I love that it starts with a con, with a whole, I broke down in front of your house. Here, I'm an important person. I have a meeting of state to get to. Take my niece and let her live with you for a few weeks. and the niece is Typhoid Mary. She's a vampire, and she's going to kill everybody. Brilliant.
See, and I always wonder about that. It's like, what is that lady doing? I mean, is she a thrall, or does she just like driving vampires around and dropping them off at people's houses?
I actually have never asked that question in my life.
What's going on there?
It's like,
in the Vampire Lovers, the Hammer take, the whole Karnstein family are evil. There's the man in black who's riding around kind of orchestrating things, and then the lady, drops people off, with the other folks at their homes. It's like, what are you guys doing? Is this just like a game?
It's like Uber for vampires.
Yes.
There you go.
It is.
Vuber.
Let me ask you a question, and then I'd like to, if there's any questions from the audience, I'd love to get them, because we do have people in the audience. So if they have questions, please. But my question is, if you were to sit down, like if you had an idea tonight and you were to sit down and try to write a new vampire book or novel or whatever, do you find it like, what do you hear out there? I've been hearing for 30 years, vampires are dead. Don't come to me with your vampires. And then something comes through and like, oh, well, that's interesting. Okay, that's fine. What is that about? It seems to me like vampires are always dead and always coming back as a thing that we can publish and make movies about. Or have you perceived this?
Well,
maybe I'm,
a lot of the pre-reviews we got for Bloodsucker City, Jason, I was amazed at how many people were like, referenced Twilight.
Yeah.
And when I originally wrote Bloodsucker City,
which we have not referenced all evening, by the way, I should mention. They're very important books.
Oddly enough, no one mentioned as their favorite. Yeah.
No.
I was amazed that I haven't even really thought of Twilight in years, and was it the early 2000s the books came out or something? I mean, it's forever ago, and yet that was the thing where when I wrote Bloodsucker City as a screenplay in 2012 or 13 originally, before I adapted to be a prose book, that's what I was being told when I was shopping it around LA, was like, they're like, no, vampires are dead, Twilight killed it, you got to go dormant for a while. That it just took a big dump on the whole genre here. And fair enough. Okay. Yeah. I personally have not read the books, and I don't make a judgment either way. I think there's a great vampire story out there for everybody. And obviously those books found an audience, and great for that. Maybe that's a great gateway for some people, into real vampire literature. Anyway, but I was amazed at how many people in their reviews of Bloodsucker City said things like, these aren't your sparkly vampires, these are real vampires and stuff like that. That I don't know if it's fair to call it a misstep in vampire literature, left a really big footprint. It's incredible. And it does seem like maybe the genre is just now climbing back out from under that. I guess maybe, and again, without ascribing any kind of moral whatever, maybe it's like Batman trying to get back out from under the Adam West impression. Yeah. And it took that literary character a while to overcome the preconceptions that came with that incarnation. Quite 25 years at least. To reassert itself, and it took the Dark Knight Returns and a lot of the literature to come out before they could do the movie in '89. So maybe that's what it is. But you'd hear it about stuff all the time. You hear about zombies. Zombies are dead. Okay, well, obviously zombies are dead. That's the whole point. But yeah. I think it's just like people like to say, and I think it makes it easier to say no. Sometimes
it's possible. Christopher, have you? Yeah, because your timing, I'm thinking about it for your book series, kind of coincides with when I was hearing the most of the vampires are dead stuff. Have you encountered this bizarre conversation?
Yeah, I think I caught like the tail end of the last vampire wave with Nathaniel Cade and the Blood Oath books. I think Jim basically nailed it though. All of this is cyclical. Everything goes. Zombies were, completely a dollar store genre until 28 Days Later and the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead came out, and then suddenly it was huge again. 30 years ago, you couldn't sell 20 years ago, you couldn't sell a superhero script in Los Angeles. Now everything has to be a superhero script. There was a time, when, Marvel couldn't give away the rights to their characters.
That's right. Yeah.
Everything is cyclical. I think, for a while, the market reached saturation point because there were a dozen or so vampire movies in development at any given time. And there's only so many, even as dedicated as we all are to watching all of them, there's only so many movies people can watch about vampires at any time. Before Twilight, vampires were direct to video, bad pay-per-view movies and TV shows. They couldn't, and then suddenly it was huge again. So I think we just ride it out. Maybe
That's
Morbius.
Really
maybe if Morbius is a massive hit next year, then you'll see vampire movies become enormous again.
Well, and they're remaking Blade as well,
Right.
so which we hadn't mentioned, which is also great, by the way. I went back and watched the Blade films, and I'm like, yep, no, these still hold up as ridiculously fantastic. So yeah, absolutely. And I do think too, like I'm interested personally in let's see what every culture and every demographic brings to their vampire story. I want to see, I don't think you can say a genre has been played out until you let everybody to the table. So, I want to keep seeing everybody's different, again, cultural class, identity, all of that. My favorite thing about Sparkly Vampires was I was in New Orleans, and I had a place to be, so I was moving quickly, and I was dressed like I'm always dressed, and I had my hair up in a black hat, and I had a long black coat on. I'm a goth, but I was also a goth in a hurry in New Orleans, and I realized that like I'm a New Yorker, and so when I walk fast in the South, this is preternaturally
Like
fast.
light speed.
Right.
And so here I am, like it's it's dusk. And I'm under the gaslights of Rue Royale, and my coat's billowing, and I pass this gaggle of teenagers, and one elbows the other, and I just hear as I pass, "Oh my God, that was a legit vampire." and then I was like, and I felt like as a goth, I was like, yes. And then the qualifier came, and this literally, I was like, put this on my tombstone. That wasn't any of that sparkling shit. That was some old school Anne Rice shit right there. I've never felt so validated in my life.
Such a wonderfully literate teenager.
Oh, it was so great. And I felt it was my favorite thing that's ever happened to me in random passersby. It was like the best catcalling one could ever have hoped for in that regard.
That's awesome.
So legit vampire. You're welcome to call me that at any point. I will respond.
Okay, we definitely should be wrapping up because I know that we've gone over time, and I apologize. So let me do this. First of all, thank you. I've really enjoyed this, and I have a feeling we could just kind of talk about vampires for hours and figure out other, because we didn't even mention Poppy Bright. It's like one of my all-time favorite vampire authors.
Yeah.
Les Daniels.
Oh my gosh, I have bought the Les Daniels books, and I've only started writing them. And what a rich.
Oh
world.
man, they're amazing.
But anyway, I want to give each of you an opportunity to just shout out what one at a time, what where people should go, where they can find your work, and anything we didn't get to talk about. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again some other time. So I'll just continue around the way that I'm looking at it on the screen. So Christopher, thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Thank you so much, Jason. You can find all my books on Amazon and IndieBound and bookshop.org. I've got novellas and books in the Cade Vampire series. I also have a couple novels about a psychic spy named John Smith, and I have one book about the Fountain of Youth called The Eternal World. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't, if you're looking for really good vampire stories that I forgot to mention, Kim Newman's Anno Dracula series, which is amazing. and Charlie Houston's Brooklyn Vampire series, which is the complete opposite end of the spectrum, but is like film noir vampires.
Cool. Thank you very much. And I've read the Psychic Vampire book, and the Psychic, that was fantastic. Jim, what about you? Where can they find? I mean, we know what your most recent
some crazy guy put out a book I wrote about vampires recently. So yeah, Bloodsucker City's on Amazon, both in paperback and in ebook format. My first book is a nonfiction exploration of a lot of myths and boogeyman stories that come out of Pennsylvania, where I'm from. It's called American Cryptic. It's also on Amazon, and I think it's on Barnes and Noble as well. Let's see. I have a haunted heist film from 2013 called House of Bad. It's free to watch on Tubi right now. My martial arts streaming series Immortal Hands will be coming out next year, and which is also about immortals, actually. So there's another tie in there, at least, even though I skipped outside the genre for a minute. And then I'm just about to start shooting a horror film with actress Sadie Katz from House of Bad and from the Wrong Turn series called The Beast Within, starring her and Vernon Wells from, you guys might know him from The Road Warrior as the Mohawk motorcycle riding Wes. He's in it, and it's an exorcism movie about a woman that nobody believes she's possessed and is forced to move into a motel room and exorcise herself.
Awesome.
We're shooting that in December, and that should also be out in 2022.
That sounds amazing.
Thank you. Thank you,
Should be
Jim.
fun.
That's really great. Leanna, what about you?
So you can find me at myfullname.com, so leannarenehieber.com, and I have a bunch of different series out, so available wherever books are sold. You don't have to have read one of my books to start with another one of my books, but they are all in a shared universe. Just start with book one in any given series. My latest series is the Spectral City series, which is about psychic detectives helping solve weird crime in Manhattan in 1899. And definitely check out An Unholy Thirst by Charles's new Pavon Press. And I'm very, very thrilled. I'm in a wonderful company of fellow authors in An Unholy Thirst. So also I'm narrating a bunch of audiobooks via Scribed. So if you go to scribed.com and you can check out, they have a wealth of books available digitally as well as audiobooks there. So I have a new series about a time slip character who's living four past lives all concurrently and into the future. So yeah, a very interesting speculative fiction tale with that. And then I get to actually narrate the audiobooks, which has been a real joy. So and also I've got a bunch of stories in all of Jason's fabulous Castle of Horror anthologies. So definitely check out the Castle of Horror anthologies, because those have been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Charles, what about you?
Well, I'll jump directly from Leanna's nice recommendation. The new book, the anthology, An Unholy Thirst, it's edited by Cliff Biggers and myself, and it's subtitled 15 Tales of Vampires, and we have a wide range of vampires. Some of them are traditional, some of them are not even remotely traditional. We wanted the authors to do, whatever worked for them, but there's a new Sonia Blue story in there by Nancy Collins. There's obviously Amanda DeWeese, who's in the audience right now.
Who's in the? I was wanting to point out that Amanda DeWeese.
She's out there.
She's
got a very cool story in there. Jeff Strand, Lee Murray, John Hartness. Cliff has a story in there. Josh Reynolds. So I mean, we've got a really Cat Scully, John Linwood Grant. We've even got a story in there by Donald F. Glute, one of my heroes.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, and there's it's just I think a really strong anthology. So I'm very proud of that. And it's vampires, vampires, vampires. So you can find that at my Amazon page. My two vampire books, Dracula's Revenge and Dracula's Ghost, they're there as well. And basically, what if Dracula had been killed at the end of the novel Dracula, and somebody resurrected him and turned him loose in Georgia in 2019. So
nice.
a lot of fun there. And then Also,
And it is a potboiler. It's an adventure, which
it is an
I
adventure.
really admire. Yeah.
I am an action adventure writer. I always tell people that I'm not a horror writer. I'm an action adventure writer who likes monsters.
Right.
And in fact, you've got one of my vampire stories in one of the Castle of Horror books, which is the takeoff on Dark Shadows. And then Congregations of the Dead, which I mentioned before, which is one of the Griffin and Price series by me and James A. Moore. So, like I say, go to my Amazon page. You can see everything there. And I'm on Twitter.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. And I think we might have a question here in chat. Just Amanda says, thanks for the shout out. She has this amazing story also in, I think, Women Running from Houses.
She does.
It's a collection. Yeah. Wow. Well, and of course, you can find Castlebridge Media's books at castlebridgemedia.com. And we'll have this up on YouTube. So I'll make sure that you guys get the link to it. Thank you for staying over. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
So much.
Thank you.
Happy book birthday, Jim. And
thank you.
Congratulations, Jim.
I owe all of you guys a lot.
Seriously.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
wonderful
much,
evening.
Jason.
You as well.
Everybody.